folks, welcome back. This is Elliot with the Poor Proles Almanac, here with my co-host.
What's up? It's Andy.
Yeah, we're doing this thing. And you can find us on Spotify, iTunes, and wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you can find us on Patreon if you're enjoying what we're doing here and you'd like to help us cover the cost of hosting the podcast. We don't explicitly offer any traditional content focused on the specific goals of this podcast to our Patreons in terms of limited access or anything like that right now. Knowledge is for everyone. But we have started up with a Patreon-only miniseries called The Prologues, during which we will do some critiques on various ecological subject matters. We've also included clips of this entire series up on the Patreon as well, so if you want to hear stuff from all of the episodes, go check it out. We've also released one episode that was asked by popular demand for public consumption, so that's a good place to check it out and see if you would like to hear more. On top of this content, we've got stickers available, and we're including some footage from Andy's farm, putting the theory we're talking about into practice. So if you want to see what's going on over there and some animals, check out the Patreon. Any support we can get to offset the actual cost, we fully and wholeheartedly appreciate. We're on Instagram and Facebook if you want to follow us over there, and we also have a Discord where we have an open discussion about some of the topics that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So, in this episode, we're talking with Ask PDFs from people with institutional access, and we had a conversation about, what did we talk about, Andy?
What did we talk about? So, Asks for PDFs from People with Institutional Access is a Facebook group which organizes over 100,000 people that are either interested in research or work with a school and have access to said research. Because, as you've noticed, a lot of our episodes so far have been fairly knowledge heavy, and a lot of it's not stuff you can traditionally find if you just Google any of the subject matters that we've looked into, especially in the most recent series that we did, the Prole Models series. And a lot of that comes from research that's been done by academics. And the goal of the project is to make that research accessible to everyone, instead of just people that work for universities or other research institutions. The conversation sort of shifted from access for individuals to the role of limiting access to places, primarily colonized regions, to limit access to things like medical knowledge and things like that. So we ended up tying this into, I guess, the role of capitalism and making sure that there's equitable and symmetrical access to knowledge so that people across the globe can develop and construct the things they need through the ownership of the public domain.
Right. And the current system that we have now is sort of a closed loop where the people who are, I guess, how do we say this? The people who are supported to do the research are the same people who are validating the research, who are the same people who are packaging the information and data collected from that research, and those are the same people who are publishing the information. So there's this closed loop where as this information and data is collected, and it's sort of like they sell licenses to use it, but only to specific groups and not, It's
priced so that people can't access it individually, or even when you consider global capitalism, where the US dollar can be used as a tool to make information inaccessible, even to major universities internationally. And, it speaks to one of the things I use as one of my common thoughts about any subject matter is if the information doesn't follow what seems like logic, then you aren't seeing the whole picture. And, as a former academic, that was always my big issue is why do schools buy into the research model where these peer-reviewed quote unquote journals have so much sway and charge them so much money to access the information that their own researchers are doing? And in this conversation that we have, the missing pieces that make that oddity make sense kind of come to light. And, it speaks to a lot of the things we've talked about in this podcast in terms of the role of global capitalism and limiting access and information to the people that need it the most. So hopefully you guys enjoy this conversation. When we started this project, I was familiar with the Asks for PDFs Facebook page because I'm a former academic who I just enjoy doing research, and as you probably know, you lose access pretty quickly. And even when you are in an institution, you still sometimes have limited access to things that you want. So for folks that aren't familiar with Asks for PDFs from people with institutional access, can you tell them about it a bit?
I'm in a graduate program at a major Canadian university in visual studies and architecture, this kind of field. I'm working on education related to architecture and the arts and the ways that that intersects with, different forms of colonialism and capitalism in the classroom and also out of the classroom. And this Facebook group, it you have a request for a certain paper or PDF, academic, scientific, medicine, whatever it is, you post a request on the group. Someone who's also a member of the group has that access, maybe through their university, through their hospital, whatever it is. They access the paper and they give it to you. That's pretty much it. There's not really uh, it's not that there's no space for discussions or these kind of things, but that's not really the purpose of the group. It's sort of very mechanical. You have this thing you want, there's no way to get it, here's a way to get it, period. That's kind of, I guess that's kind of the goal of the group, is to make that possible.
Fair enough. So we start a lot of our episodes with the idea that we are trying to share knowledge and information. And we have a little catchphrase that knowledge is for everyone. And I feel like this fits very snugly right into place with what we're talking about. There is this paywall behind information and knowledge at some point when, any person will have questions, whether you're just curious about a hobby or you are going to school to learn about a subject. At some point, you're going to have questions that most likely somebody has already asked before. And so that information is out there, it is available, but you shouldn't have to pay for that when you've spent so much time, which time is money. You've spent so much time looking for the answer, like, and some other people are discussing it. It's not like it's some secret. So why do you have to go through all the trouble of having to pony up or ante up some money for it? And so it's an interesting concept, and it seems like this is a very simple way of using, the social media tool to tackle a simple problem. I'm looking for this information, who has it, and also, when somebody else asks for information that you have, you share as well. Sorry, how long has the group been around or active?
I'm not actually sure when the group started, because I remember initially there were like a bunch of smaller groups that different people had started. I had started one myself, and we ended up essentially saying we might as well consolidate some of these groups together. So that's effectively what happened. I closed the group I ran, for example, and then I moved over to this group. It only had like maybe 1,000 people on it, and this group at the time had maybe 20,000 people on it, and now it's, I think, close to like 100,000, which is a lot, possibly too much. We're kind of bumping up against those like limitations of being able to moderate a group that large that Facebook itself places, sort of structurally. And to be honest, I don't think there's like a solution to that. We're really looking for a job that the platform on which we're operating does not place any kind of importance. So it's not surprising, but it's also, we're at that level where things are becoming very difficult because of the way Facebook is designed. And I can describe that in detail. Some of it is pretty interesting. Maybe not, like, not something people would notice.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious. We interviewed Dr. Newby from Project Gutenberg, and they still operate as an all volunteer team. And I was really curious about how that actually works in practice. And I mean, I mod a small group. It's like 5,000 people. And it's for the four of us, it's like sometimes can be like chaos. So I can only imagine what's going on in something like that.
Well, I think, many of the problems come from this desire, I think, within the design of Facebook to create a system it's very cut and dry. Like, either this person is a problem and they need to be kicked out of the group, or they're allowed to stay and they can do anything they want. And I think part of it is because those kinds of decisions drive engagement on Facebook. It's not really a question of how can we moderate this engagement. It's more of a question of how can we moderate who gets to engage and who doesn't? Which is like two different ways of thinking about engagement. And I very much would want to moderate how we engage. I'm not really so concerned in like sort of laying down the law about who gets to engage. You know what I mean?
Right.
So we often get these problems where, for example, someone will post a request, let's say, for something that might be considered, let's call it problematic, right? And in honestly, in almost every single case I've seen where someone is posting a request for something like this, they want to look into it because they're doing some research that is working against that history or against that piece of information. Like they're deliberately requesting it because they're working against it. And I honestly think that's great. Like go back to the original sources. If you want to take a huge shit on something because it's like genuinely terrible, you got to read what it says.
Right.
But the pylon of people being like, oh my god, this is so terrible, how dare you ask for this, don't you know this author was a racist, a pedophile, whatever it is so quick and so instant that it like sort of immediately just like prevents that request, one, from being answered, and also two, prevents that person, I think, from sort of willing to put themselves into this position of like, let's actually see how we can engage with these horrible, reprehensible ideas at like a structural level. Suddenly they're like sort of left behind, and they're like relying on doing this on like a superficial level where they're like, these ideas look bad, instead of how can these ideas like be shown to be bad or something like this.
Right. Right. It's taking a specific example of something that's bad and taking the idea of it and showing that, that's a bad thing. And it's a simple, I mean, it's not simple, but I guess it's a way of swapping out or replacing the bad thing with the idea of the bad thing that is, I don't want to use this word, but I will. It's toxic in itself because it prevents people from seeing the other side of things clearly, which is, it can be dangerous, but it can also be beneficial depending on what that person does with the knowledge. But you're saying we shouldn't really police whether they should have that knowledge or not. You're saying, knowledge is for everyone, and let that person do what they will with it. That's a different story. That's a different kind of policing that you'd have to deal with at that point, right?
Yeah, I think in many ways, like, I don't know, I want to trust people. I think people are good, and if you're on a group that's about sharing PDFs for research, like I have a hard time imagining there's some extremely vile, like sort of person who's maybe writing a manifesto on like racial purity or something. Like I would not be expecting that kind of person to be a part of a group like that. Those people have their own spaces. So like, what is this expectation that we are trying to police like each other within our already small sort of splinter groups? It just seems unproductive, um
Absolutely.
yeah.
And you also take the roots of where Facebook started, where you needed a college what was it, a college email address to sign up for Facebook originally. And it
Hmm.
was for college students and finding a way to connect academia and social and intermingle all of those things. And now it's turned into something else where the exact idea of the group is to share information and knowledge between, you know,
Hmm.
people who are trying to research and learn
Yeah.
whatever information. And now it's become a problem through the terms of use agreement and whatever social contract people have when they go on and argue about whatever the hell they're arguing about on
Yeah.
Facebook.
Yeah. And that argument, I like, it's such a structural part of how Facebook is designed. It's like, for example, and I'm completely drawing these examples from like actual events that have happened on the group that I could show you, for example, like if we wanted screenshots or something. But so let's say someone posts this request for something that other people consider reprehensible. Instantly it starts to get this sort of the react button, right? Like people will react very quickly. Let's say 800 people decided to like the post, but then maybe 25 or 50 people decided to angry react on the post, or even if two people decided to angry react on the post, right? That post honestly is going to be higher up in the scrolling order than a post that received 9,000 just likes.
Because of that
Little
contention.
angle.
Right.
And then the other interesting thing is that when you look at the post, if you're just sort of scrolling through, it'll say 850 people have reacted to this. And then right next to it, you'll see a little icon of an angry face and a little icon of a like, almost implying that like 850 people are evenly split between anger and support, which is totally not true, right? It's like 50 people have angry reacted and 800 people have like positive reacted. So, it's sort of implying this kind of, oh, everything is even. Like some people agree, some people disagree. It's sort of like denying you that like simple math of like, okay, there's only a few people who disagree with this. And that's just one thing, right? When people start commenting on these posts, which is another, moderation nightmare. Like let's say you see this post and you decide to maybe respond in some detail, right? You decide to sort of break down the source. You're like, well, you're requesting a source by this person, and this person supported, I don't know, colonialism in, Belgian colonialism in Africa. And, this is a very, like, I can't believe you're requesting this source, but at the same time, if you're writing a paper from this point of view, then this source might actually be useful because it contains this kind of evidence. And, maybe you decide to unpack it a little bit and like try and help this person out, maybe clarify their position or something. As soon as you click submit, your comment is going to be squished to like the top 3 lines, and there's going to be like a little 3 dots next
ellipsis. Yeah.
And the moment people start piling on, there's like 5,000 comments on this thing. Yours is just one of, 10 bazillion comments that people are scrolling through. And now people are reacting to those comments. And because there are so many comments, the comments that go to the top of the list are the ones with the most angry/happy reacts on it. So then the most like argumentative one-line comments literally are driven to the top.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just this like horrible, vicious cycle that's impossible to moderate, almost by design.
Right. The algorithm isn't designed for you to be able to moderate a discussion. It's designed to create as much discourse as possible. Yeah. And you can't really, control. That's not a discussion. That's a bunch of people mumbling in a peanut gallery, which is exactly what they're looking for. And it all starts with a simple question of what the hell's going on? You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think this all stems back to a really fundamental understanding of, you'd brought up like how else would you do something like this? How would you coordinate a connection with all these people that have these resources or are looking for these resources? And what Facebook is designed to do, and that's to generate money through marketing. By all the refreshing and all of those different activities, they can show 10,000 actions on a post or whatever it might be, and that allows them to charge more money for advertisement. This also points to another issue of the fact that I don't think people outside of academia or research fully understand the complexities of how both research is funded and how access to that research is throttled in a lot of different ways. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think maybe people might not know that most of academic publishing is controlled by 5 publishers. If you've been in school and you've seen one of those, physics textbooks for like a first year class that cost, I don't know, $250, and it's got like a CD in the back or something, it's published by one of these groups, right? And the names of these groups are increasingly hyphenated because they're just like buying up each other. So I think like the top 3 right now are hyphenated names. So there's Reed Elsevier, Wiley Blackwell, Taylor Francis, Springer, and there's one more that I can't remember right now. But
it's amazing that you got that far.
I mean, this is something that, I'm constantly like, oh my God, these, yeah. But some of the numbers I think around these groups are maybe more illustrative of how deep this problem goes. Something like 70% of all papers in the social sciences are published by one of these 5, conglomerates. And I think something like 55% of all papers in the sciences are published by these groups, which is, that's staggering. 5 publishers having control of 50% to 70% of all academic publishing is absolutely insane.
Yeah, and it doesn't look like that either. If you were to go publish something, you wouldn't think that it's only that many publishers.
Oh, yeah.
Like it's very well hidden. Just like
definitely.
If you go to the grocery store and you see, Kraft versus, whatever brand, and they're all owned by Kraft or Kellogg or whoever it is. I don't know. But yeah, that same model has kind of taken place in academia.
So yeah, a lot of it is that way, and but essentially it's like almost completely and entirely, I mean, this is not surprising, profit driven from that point of view. I think in like 1985, the publishers they had a 50% profit margin in 1985. Like I can only imagine what those numbers are like now with all that consolidation and the monopoly that they've managed to build up over this time, because essentially they have very little to no overhead, because the research that's being published in the journals that they own is supported by either the government or private funding. These sort of privately funded institutions for research that like carry a person's name. These institutions are paying for the research. The research is being conducted typically on federally funded, or here in Canada, provincially funded laboratories, or on provincially or federally funded universities. But then somehow for that research to be legitimized, it needs to be published in one of these journals. And then the crazy thing is, the only place where those journals have a market is in those same universities. It's this horrible cycle into which these five, vampires have like inserted themselves in this like particular point in the life cycle of research. So taxpayers pay for the research. Research is conducted, and for some reason it like needs to go through this like gateway, and then the same taxpayers purchase that research back, suddenly like legitimized by these vampires. It's absolutely insane.
Right. So they've created a messed up positive feedback loop where they get to double dip for information that, the people have paid for, and then they sell, they compile the information, I guess, into data and then sell it back to the people who paid for it.
Yeah, and often it's not even, and the reason they have no overhead, this is the thing, they'll always, many of the publishers will often say that what they provide is the thing that makes science work, which is peer review. They're like, oh, this is the journal, we provide peer review. Sure, you can do your research in your university, but if it's not peer reviewed, it's not science. That's their argument. But the big dirty secret is that people, like, no one's being paid for peer review. Peer review is literally a volunteer process done at universities by those same professors as part of their like job duties at the university. So these people literally have no overhead. You know what I mean? Like, it's insane. It's insane. They're not paying a salary to anyone apart from fucking, the management. Exactly. It's absolutely insane.
Yeah, and it's not even like the articles are cheap. Like every time I go to get one, it's like, oh, this is available for 24-hour access for $20, or you can buy it for $39.99. It's like a 12-page article.
So as a layman, what's to stop institutions of, reputation and distinguished places that have the ability to do these peer reviews? What's to stop them from teaming up and say, you conduct your research and we will peer review each other? And how is that not just as legitimate as what the publishers are doing now?
I think in many ways it's the sort of the years of legitimacy that these journals have built up. Honestly, that seems to be the main thing.
Right.
It's
all based on reputation.
Yeah, it's definitely all based on reputation. So physics has this this group called Archive, where it's with an X. And I think there's also an equivalent for biology. I can't remember what it's called right now, but it kind of follows the same system. Something with an X and then Archive, where you can publish pre-review papers, which are often, in most cases, just identical papers, because they typically almost always pass peer review once they've reached that point. And so a lot of places are looking at that, but your work on Archive is not as legitimate as your work in Cell magazine or or Nature or something like this, which one of the big publishers own. So it's definitely a legitimacy thing, and that's also how they like set up these journals in the first place. When Cell, for example, they started this journal, like literally the publisher started this journal, sort of purchased the work of this very, very important and influential, like upcoming guy at MIT, asked him to be the journal editor, asked him to put together like a who's who list and have them all submit their articles into this. Very quickly, astroturfed this like amazing journal everybody wants to be on from out of nowhere, and now it's like their journal, everybody wants to be on it because that's what makes your career. That's how you get the actual money, which is not being published in the journal, which is appointments at universities. There's no money for even the scientists in journal publishing. Literally the only people profiting from it are shareholders in like Elsevier or Blackwell or whatever.
It's wild. Yeah, I can't even, every time I think about that, it just makes me so mad. It's just like surreal.
And you use the word vampires, and now that you've explained it, I see exactly what you mean, how they literally just feed on other people's work. And it's peer reviewed by the same people who are doing the work, and then they turn around and say, yep, this is valid, like good job everybody, and then they sit there and count coins.
Crazy. Yeah.
So has the group, since you've been involved with it at least, ever been exposed to any retaliatory actions from any of the publishers or anything like that?
They haven't, and to be honest, I would be extremely surprised if they are. And okay, I'm trying to figure out how to explain this, and honestly, the best way to explain this is kind of like, so I heard the most recent podcast you guys put up. I like to listen to podcasts when I run, and I decided that's I'm going to listen to the one that you.
Thank you so much.
So the most recent one, at least on my phone, I don't know if you've put any newer ones, was the one about the subsistence farmers around Lake Turkana, and that's the word I'm looking for. Subsistence farming. You know what I mean? Like those guys are not a threat to Monsanto. You know what I mean? Like Monsanto's not after them, even if they manage to get their hand on like some sweet Monsanto GMO seeds. Like Monsanto's not coming after them. You know what I mean? It's kind of the same thing here. Like this group is literally subsistence education.
Yeah.
We are not a threat. And I would honestly be completely shocked if any of the publishers decided that we were a threat. It's literally people from like countries where I doubt more than 2 or 3 major universities even subscribe to any of the big journals. So in many cases, this is not a market that Reed Elsevier, Wiley Springer, and would even have a hope of entering. So we're not threatening any existing market. And I think that's the only thing keeping this group safe, is the fact that we're not a threat.
And no problems with Facebook?
No problem with Facebook. I think, yeah, I mean, if Facebook decided to, yeah, I mean, I would be surprised. It's not as, let's say, not blatant, like it's definitely very blatant, but it's not as easily, like the profits that are being lost are not as easily seen as, let's say, the profits being lost from like a blockbuster movie that's being like torrented or something. Like that equivalency just doesn't exist. Those profit margins don't exist that people can see. So we're kind of safe in that way. Because we're
not really a black market, it's like a gray market.
Yeah.
That's badass. I like it.
And to speak to that episode, pretty much all of the most recent episodes that have been kind of like deep dives, like all of the research has come from either that group or one of the things I was going to bring up earlier and I forgot to, is that there's a collection of access points for places to get data without having to ask for it. So for people that just want to try to find it on their own, there's like a graph that's up there that points to like all the different ways to find stuff. A spreadsheet that exists that's looks like it's continuously updated and edited to find different ways to find papers. And I literally have that as like one of my saved tabs because I use it so often. It's, it's one of those things that just, it's so simple, yet it makes such a significant difference. And just giving people access to things that can make meaningful change in terms of doing research and things that you're interested in, keeping the public ownership of things like science and all of these other things that become very ivory tower. And I'm not sure, and this is kind of a little bit of a tangent, but I'm very curious if that is a component of why there's so much anti-intellectualism today, is because that knowledge is so inaccessible, even if somebody wants to find it.
I kind of agree. I think it's much more, for example, like even if many of the, let's say, papers in the sciences were suddenly made accessible, I doubt that they would be of use.
They're definitely too complicated in most cases.
Yeah, exactly. And even if we were able to, let's say, give an independent researcher access to these papers, there's like, what can you do without a lab? You know what I mean? What can you do without collaborators? Like, there's just not much, I think, in much of the sciences that's possible to do in a certain sense, even if you had access. I think it's much more a question of like this anti-intellectualism exists as like it's like a necessary function of this like colonial system, which is that that research is not really being prevented from, let's say, people on the street in America and in Canada. That research is being held back from people in Romania, in Ghana, in India, in Pakistan. Those are the people who are being held back from that research, because the thing is, they have access to laboratories in those countries, right? They have access to collaborators in those countries, but what they don't have is the ability to pay like $2 million for a journal subscription. So those are really the people who I think are the targets of this theft
Sure.
ultimately. Because I mean, if we were to like zoom out of this system and look even bigger, the taxpayer funding for Canada, that goes to paying for these things, that comes from the like mining companies in Canada, for example, like contribute to the Canadian economy, which are like extracting resources from Pakistan and Papua New Guinea and Ghana. So in a sense, it's the pillaging of that community originally. Like that's really what's happening here. And I think the anti-intellectualism is just like a result of the system that those things opaque. So like that's the real goal. And that's something that we see in our group as well, right? Like if I look at the statistics for Facebook. Oh, this is the other thing. Facebook doesn't give you an ability to see statistics on who the group consists of or where they're from. But that database, I own that database.
You get a list of names, but you get no metrics or
Nothing at
demographics
all.
on it.
Yeah, on Facebook.
Yeah.
There's no ability to control, and obviously you can report, yourself as whatever you want on Facebook. So like we'll have trolls who identify themselves as like, as what they perceive to be the person with the least privilege, so that they can then construct this argument about how privilege is this idea gone crazy or something. They'll sort of come up and say that they're a transgender person of this ethnicity from this part of the world, and they, for one, don't believe in Black Lives Matter. And you're like, oh my God, are like it's so obvious that these things happen, but the lack of transparency Facebook gives you in dealing with these invented users is none, like nil. We get no ability to control this whatsoever, which can make things very difficult. Honestly, it can make things super hard. You have this person who has like a Malcolm X profile photo, posting the most insane things just to get people energized and excited, and like just like foaming at the mouth about taking a shit on someone else who's actually sort of trying to be thoughtful and working on it.
So to go back to the group, and you talked a little bit about how administration works, I'm curious about kind of how the volunteerism plays into longevity and involvement and things like that.
I think there are like, I'm going to say like 4 to 5 year sort of cycles. Like there's a particular part in your life where you have this drive to be, to feel like you're a part of actually creating the life you want to live, and you're like actively working. And that's not so much a volunteer job as it is your like daily affirmations that like I can make the world that I want to live in. And so that volunteerism really is like at the output of that feeling that you have. And in my experience, most people who like that sort of works itself out, or maybe works itself into different parts of your life, I'm not sure, over like 4 or 5 years. And so we'll kind of get these cycles of like people will join the group, they last about 4 to 5 years. Towards the end, they sort of start to tail off, become less active moderators or suppliers of content. And then they just sort of drop off the radar. And then we kind of, start the cycle of finding new moderators again. That's just been my experience so far.
When people ask for content, Does there always seem like there are people willing to help out, or are there? I'm just trying to think about like the necessary volunteerism versus the demand that's out there. Is there a balance in it, or does it seem to like naturally just be enough volunteers to meet the demand for various papers, or is there like a significant input from people like administration or a handful of people that kind of absorb a lot of that work?
In a way, like that exact imbalance initially is where the database and the chart and all of that came from as a way to remedy that. And that was definitely an imbalance earlier on. There were a lot more people obviously requesting things than were prepared to supply things, but I think we're doing pretty well now. The number of unanswered requests is quite low, and is often because those resources are like genuinely not available. Maybe it's like a pre-publishing book, or there's just no one who has access to that specific library or that specific university's library. But we've been, the success rate of requests has been pretty high, which is good.
So the like self-organization kind of works once you get to a certain
It does,
certain size.
kind of works, yeah.
I'm just kind of thinking.
No, I wouldn't say the organization works. I would say the the access that scale provides.
Yeah.
Works.
So like at what scale? Like when did you start to notice it? Was it when the group was at like 20, 25,000, or was it larger? Or do you just not really remember?
Yeah, I mean, it's just been a slow thing.
Sure.
Honestly, I don't think that there's maybe. I mean, I'm sure Facebook has like a magic number, but I think that number really depends on the platform.
Yeah, I was just kind of curious if there was like a number where it's like, oh, once we had this many people, there was enough people with different resources that it kind of finally just gelled a little bit. As somebody that doesn't have a background in organizing big groups and what you guys are doing, and while I did work in academia once, that was a decade ago now. Is there anything that you think people aren't aware of that's kind of going on in the background of things, of organizations like this or in academia, that you think is important to talk about?
I mean, I think the most important thing to know is the cross connectivity of research across countries, honestly, is such a huge thing. And in the acknowledgement of that cross connectivity, sometimes I think we, or at least that I've seen on the group, and also sometimes in university, we lose sight of the purpose of much of our coalition building or organization building. So for example, if we look at, one of the most popular online sources that like scrapes journals, obviously illegally from publishing websites is Sci-Hub, right? Just founded by this Kazakhstani student in, I don't know, sometime in the mid 2000s, I think, or something like that. And if we look at the statistics of papers requested from Sci-Hub, the papers requested, so something like 20%, which is a huge chunk, the most of any sort of category, something like 20% of those papers are papers in medicine. And of all papers on Sci-Hub, 70% are requested by countries that are not North America, Western Europe, or sort of developed East Asia. So what kind of research exactly are people stealing? It's like literally medicine in countries that honestly will like hugely benefit from access to these resources. And so often we'll have arguments on the group. Sometimes I think from a point of concern, sometimes from a place that's hard to tell if it's a troll or if it's or if it's not a troll, where it'll be a question of, let's say, some question of a certain form of rights or a certain question about equity that exists in North America, maybe in Western Europe, but that is so far from the radar in many of these countries that it almost makes no sense to sort of start from that place. Those requests, not that those requests aren't, not that those concerns aren't valid, but it's just like, man, you don't understand. You know what I mean? Like the place that this person is requesting this research from might as well be a different universe from the one we live in. So sometimes these kind of questions, they often feel like a troll is asking them, because it'll be pointing to the fact that this person who's requesting medical research this is an example I've seen over and over again, is stealing the work of, let's say, a Black doctor who published his work at Princeton. You know what I mean? And it's like, oh, Black people need to be compensated for their labor. And, I absolutely agree. But what am I going to do? Ask this guy from Romania to donate like 0.1 euros to this Black professor? Like, how's that going to work? You know what I mean? Like, this is the level of like
cognitive dissonance
conversation that's required here is so much beyond my capacity and our capacity as a group to remedy. But at the same time, I doubt that even if we requested that document through the official sources, that professor at Princeton is not seeing 2 cents of that money. You know what I mean? Like, he published that because that's his contractual agreement with Princeton. So like, what really are we trying to remedy here? So sometimes we have these conversations that are very difficult to moderate in the group because they fall into these sort of, I don't want to call them traps, but it's like the inability to see that this colonialism exists globally and not just, within the, let's say, like North American or European context. And that's a very hard conversation to have on Facebook with 100,000 people.
Yeah, it's one of those things I've definitely seen happen in the group. I'm just like, this is out of control, and it's really interesting to kind of hear their perspective. In a way, I don't think I've really ever thought about it. It makes a lot of sense now that you've said it, but it's just, I don't know, it never really occurred to me. Yeah, if people aren't aware of the group and they want to find it, they can find it on Facebook. Asks for PDF from people with institutional access. Any final thoughts?
No, there are definitely a lot of differing viewpoints about many of the things I've expressed my opinion on, not only within members of our excellent and hardworking admin team, but also people on the group itself. I don't mean to speak for them at all. There are definitely a lot of other valid viewpoints.
As always, if you enjoy the episode, please give us a review on iTunes, which heavily impacts our outreach to new listeners and helps us bring on new and exciting guests. We appreciate your support, and we hope you enjoyed this conversation. This is Elliot.
This is Andy.
With the Poor Proles Almanac.